Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another of our ongoing series of Military Aviation Museum webinars. We're so glad you've all joined us again this evening. I'm Keegan Chetwynd, the director of the Military Aviation Museum, and I'll be your moderator this evening. So I'm going to turn it over to Nancy Sheppard, our speaker for this evening. Nancy is the author of 4 books. She's a native of Tidewater, Virginia. She was even involved in the placing of the historical marker for the Roma, which is something of a forgotten tragedy, as you'll no doubt be aware from tonight's title. Nancy, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Keegan, for that wonderful introduction. Like Keegan said, my name is Nancy E. Sheppard, and I am a nonfiction author and historian. I would like to thank the Military Aviation Museum for hosting this webinar today and for hosting all these webinars during this time. I also would like to thank all of you for sharing your time with me tonight. It's an honor to talk to you today about the forgotten tragedy of the U.S. Army dirigible Roma. This is a story meant to be steeped in legend, to honor undeniable heroes, one that is filled with strife, struggle, triumph, love, loss, and failure. It is all the things that make for an epic tale or that's found inscribed upon memorials. But this, the single deadliest disaster of an American hydrogen airship, has been buried and mostly forgotten in the near century since 34 men lost their lives in the line of duty that dark day in 1922. Today, we'll bring them back to life, hear their voices, celebrate their lives, grieve their sacrifices, and honor these brave men whose memories were buried alongside their bodies. World War I took warfare from land and sea into the air. German Zeppelins bombarded London and instilled a fear of what could happen from the sky in the dead of night. The time following the war was one of equally brilliant change for technology and for society. Relief swept the nation after the Treaty of Paris was signed, stripping the Rhineland of its military might. One of the overarching innovations that came from the war was the brilliant military use of air power. Planes, or heavier than aircraft, were fragile but fast. The truth is, they were not that practical. They couldn't carry really any cargo, and at one point during the war, the shelf life for a pilot was only 2 weeks. It was a race between which technology would prevail, and many argued that it would be the airships or lighter than air. There are several different types of airships, and right now you are seeing a newsreel from that time period. We had the Rigids, which are like the Zeppelins, which were the Leviathans of sometimes over 1,000 feet that could carry great numbers of cargo, people, and could perform aerial operations, sometimes a bit more efficiently than their heavier than air counterparts. Then we had the small blimps, like we think of it, the Goodyear blimp, which could only carry a handful of people, but were wonderful for espionage purposes. Lastly, and this is the technology we're going to concern ourselves with tonight, we had the love child of these 2 technologies, the semi-rigid dirigible, which could carry a substantial number of people or cargo, but was seen as a bit more steady or predictable than their rigid counterparts. General Billy Mitchell, the father of the modern U.S. force, was an advocate for the growing of the aviation branch of the U.S. Army. Newsreels, like what you're seeing now, played in local theaters, enticing young men to join the aviation branch of the military. When the Navy was charged with procuring and/or constructing the monolithic rigid ships for the military, Billy Mitchell wanted one of his own for the Army. When the Navy passed on procuring a second-hand Italian semi-rigid dirigible in late 1920, Billy Mitchell and Major Van Nostrand, the director of lighter development for the U.S. Army, wanted this airship for his own. After a minor debate, it was agreed that a crew of the best and brightest they had to offer would go to Italy, inspect the ship, and bring her home to the new lighter-than-air aviation school at Langley Field near Newport News, Virginia. One of the first chosen was Captain Dale Mabry, who you saw in this newsreel. Captain Mabry was a native of Tampa, a consummate bachelor, and an evangelist for lighter-than-air technology, and would serve as executive officer of this new ship. Major John Gray Thornell, a former infantry officer who finished near the bottom of his class at West Point, was chosen as the ship's commanding officer. He may not have been cut from the cloth of an infantryman, but he definitely was a lighter than airman. In fact, he was pulled from being the commanding officer of a new airship field in Texas in order to lead the Army's new airship, one that was set to be the biggest in the military's fleet. Third in command was Lieutenant Walter J. Reed, who is the man that my mouse is pointing to right now. He was a graduate of Columbia University with a degree in architecture. He was a brilliant and humble man, and he was discharged from the military following the war. However, his best friend, Captain Mabry, convinced him to rejoin in order to take part in this exciting time in history. Walt jumped at the idea and proposed it to his girlfriend, Maria, a native of Hampton, and along with the idea that maybe she could accompany him to Italy for the procurement of the ship, if she would marry him, of course. So the day before the crew was set to ship out to Genoa en route to Italy in February 1921, they were married in New York City with Captain Mabry serving as Walt's best man, and this image is from their wedding. A five-man crew comprised of Master Sergeant Roger McNally, Master Sergeant Harry Chen, Sergeant Joseph Biedenbach, the only one of the 8 men to have not served during World War I, Sergeant Marion Jethro Bell, and Sergeant Virgil Hoffman were on hand to come along with the 3 officers. Before leaving for Italy, Sergeant Virgil Hoffman returned to Langley Field from his native Eden Rapids, Michigan. Like many men, he was charged in the time following the war. Coming from a large railroading family, Virgil longed for more than just the rails and the steam of the engines. He longed to be back in Hampton with the girl he'd fallen madly in love with, Phoebus native Stella Hoover. He jumped at the opportunity just to be close to her and purchased a piece of property in Hampton for the two to build a home together. Just before he was set to leave for Lee, he proposed to the love of his life, and Stella excitedly agreed to be his wife. The plan was to marry in the summer of 1922. The trip to Genoa was a harrowing one. The ship, which they shared with a group of graveyard attendants and funeral directors that ferried them across the Atlantic, encountered violent storms. At one point, Walt Reed directed his new bride, Maria, to climb in an empty coffin should the ship capsize. However, with only nerves rattled, the ship arrived safely in Genoa, and a train transported the officers, crew, and Maria Reed to Rome. As per the instructions given from the Italian crown, the Italians would select the date of the inspection flight, and the Americans were only allowed to have one inspection flight of the new airship. Enthusiastic with the prospect, the terms were readily agreed upon. On March 15, 1921, the 8 officers and crewmen, Maria Reed and Major Thornell's wife, Marie, made their way to a field just outside Rome. There they were greeted by dignitaries like Robert Underwood Johnson, who was the gentleman with the white beard, and the ship's designers, including Umberto Nobile, who was standing next to Ambassador Johnson. Along with them were elite members of European society, like Prince Viggo of Denmark, who was decked out in a flamboyant dress and followed by an entourage. And there were reporters from all over Italy and the United States, including acclaimed writer Kenneth Roberts. That day, the sun shone bright overhead, and there was a warm breeze caressing the hillside. The giant barn doors of the hangar opened, and out was pulled the giant silvery machine, with black letters painted onto her side, clearly stating her name, Roma. She was unlike anything the Americans saw before. She had a rigid keel structure with a duraluminum cupola shaping her nose. She had 11 mini balloons or ballonets inside her larger gas bag. There were 6 12-cylinder engines that were the Ansaldo engines that ran parallel in pairs along the sides of the keel. And a giant rudder was mounted to the stern that resembled a box kite, similar to the wings of a triplane. This rudder would allegedly allow for greater ease of maneuverability in the air. Today would be a splendid day to fly. The airship lifted off with ease as people filtered through the passenger cabin, walked to the engines and the control cabin. The Italian captain merrily often left the wheel unattended, allowing anyone who wanted to steer the ship to do so. The ripple of air travel proved queasy to stomachs unfamiliar with what it was like to fly, which is not an uncommon occurrence amongst those in attendance. Despite this, the inspection was more of, I would say, a spectacle. Elaborate three-course meals were served on shift tables laid out with crisp linens. Wine flowed freely amongst the guests, and keep in mind this is during Prohibition in the United States. And empty bottles were chucked outside the windows. At one point, one of the American officers commented how he missed his after-meal cigar. When one of the designers reminded him that the ship was inflated with hydrogen, the American officer brushed him off, stating that, to paraphrase, one could light a bonfire in the center of the ship and nothing would happen to her. There was so much fantastical partying that no one even noticed when Roma couldn't gain the lift she needed to fly over the caldera of Mount Vesuvius, but instead flew to the volcano's side. Kenneth Roberts, this gentleman right here, described the day as having a prisoner of Zenda feel. The American crew took a little time to familiarize themselves with the Italian-built Ansaldo engines. These were ones they had never operated before. Sergeant Bell noticed that they seemed to run oily. When Roma landed after sunset that day, the Americans stumbled off the ship, some trying to regain their land legs, while others slightly intoxicated from the alcohol they had drunk that day. Major Thornell wrote to his superiors, "I am most impressed with the semi-rigid type of airship and believe it has great possibilities." Without question, the Americans wanted to bring Roma to the United States. However, there were concerns over her condition. Roma was built in 1919, originally designed for use during World War I. But when her construction was completed by the war's end, the Italians refitted her to be a transportation vessel. In fact, they had ambitions to run passenger flights on her between Rome and Rio de Janeiro, a dream that would never come to fruition. Instead, she served as a sightseeing vessel overtop the Italian capital, sometimes carrying King Victor Emmanuel himself. The bag was made from a thin silk and cotton blend, a material that could only be made in Italy. The lifespan of the bag was coming to an end, and Major Thornell advocated for a new one to be purchased in preparation for that time. Major Van Nostrand and Secretary of War Weeks told Thornell that her bag was fine and they would procure one at a later date. Major Thornell then advocated to fly her back to the United States, but Van Nostrand ordered him to disassemble the ship and pack her up in cargo crates. Thornell reluctantly agreed. A contract was signed between the Americans and the Italians to purchase Roma. While the Italians originally asked for $475,000, they readily agreed to a negotiated sale price of $184,000. And the picture on your screen now is one of the pages from the final contract. In regards to Roma, there were concerns over the condition of the gas bag, the oiliness of the engines, and the experimental box kite rudder. However, it was failed to be emphasized that there was a much more grievous danger looming literally above: hydrogen. Hydrogen had a lot of advantages. It was cheap to process and is an extremely light gas. However, the trade-off is that hydrogen is highly flammable in the quote-unquote right conditions. There were murmurings of switching to helium, but the naturally procured gas was expensive and the lift value was noticeably less than that of hydrogen. Therefore, hydrogen was the commonly used lifting gas for airships. The U.S. Navy was in the midst of procuring a British-built rigid airship. In 1921, a crew of U.S. naval aviators went to England to do a test flight aboard the R-38, which was slated to be renamed ZR-2 once it was placed under American colors. Along with this crew was Public Affairs Officer Lieutenant Clifford A. Tinker. With a background that included aeronautics, it was his job to inform both the Americans and the British of news of R-38. On August 24, 1921, the ship lost structural integrity over the Humber River in England. When oxygen mixed with the already unstable hydrogen gas inside, the ship exploded, killing all but 5 of the 49 men on board. Lieutenant Clifford Tinker accompanied the bodies of his naval brethren home. Traumatized after seeing firsthand the dangers of hydrogen, he swore that he would do all in his power to ensure that no American man would lose their life on an airship because of hydrogen. Meanwhile, Roma was shipped to Langley Field to be reassembled. Langley Field was a fairly new base sitting along the river on the Hampton Roads Peninsula in southeastern Virginia, just a short distance from the Naval Station and the Army Quartermaster Depot in Norfolk. Langley housed the heavier-than-air squadrons, a photography school, and the lighter-than-balloon school, which was recently moved from Lee Hall Depot to Langley. The base had its own hydrogen processing plant, with casks of hydrogen stacked in towers around the brick building. And nearby stood an incredible hangar tailor-made to Roma's dimensions. Stella Hoover waited in anticipation for her fiancé, Sergeant Virgil Hoffman, to come home from Italy and listen to all of his adventures as they walked in the sands of the beaches near home in Phoebus. With Roma successfully purchased, now she needed a larger crew. Several others considered to be the best and the brightest the Army LTA division had to offer came on board. Lieutenant Byron T. Burt, seen here with Captain Dale Mabry, arrived as a navigational officer. I'm uncertain if he was a lucky or unlucky man to have on board, as he had survived 3 other airship accidents. Nonetheless, he was a decorated officer and had an unparalleled understanding of the engineering of airships. Then there was Corporal Alberto Duke Flores, pictured here with Sergeant Irby Hevron, Private Gus Kingston, and Sergeant Thomas Yarborough. He was a native of Puerto Rico and had perhaps the terrifying job of any of Roma's crew. He was tasked as the man in the crow's nest at the tip top of Roma's nose cone. It was his job to monitor the tension in the bag, because any slack in this bag could mean certain death. Roma arrived at Langley Field the same month that ZR-2 crashed on the other side of the pond. The public was enraged by the tragedy that happened in England, but the Army, particularly Major Van Nostrand, tried to deflect attention away from that disaster and towards the new grand aircraft that arrived in Virginia. Roma was billed in newspapers with words of grandeur describing her as the American Eagle of the fleet. But what the public didn't know is what the crew found once opening the pine boxes she was shipped in. If you have ever been to our part of the world, then you know that Tidewater, Virginia summers are not at all forgiving, between the oppressive heat and unrelenting humidity. When Master Sergeant Harry Chapman pulled Roma from her crate, he examined the gas bag. The thin silk fabric was covered in mildew and deteriorated in tatters. He described the film on the inside of the bag as resembling lukewarm beeswax. Major Thornell went to Major Van Nostrand once again, demanding that they procure a new bag. Major Van Nostrand insisted that the military did not have the funding for just such an expense, and they would have to patch up the bag as best they could. The reconstruction was supervised by Lieutenant Walter Reed, and it was complex. The blueprints had to be deciphered from their original Italian, and her complex form structure was a challenge for her crew to understand. She was refitted to include a 2-way radio system and an onboard photography studio. But the most difficult part of this entire process was maintaining hydrogen purity within the bag itself. The men placed patch over the silvery, fragile gas bag. Master Sergeant Chapman carefully monitored the hydrogen purity within Roma, but was often met with disappointment. Engineers like Jethro Bell and Virgil Hoffman trained on the oily Ansaldo engines, unfamiliar with their mechanics and workings, hesitant to their usefulness in the unpredictable climate shifts of the American mid-Atlantic. As summer turned into fall and the leaves fell from the trees that year, pressure was put on Roma's crew to get her up and flying. She was constantly being touted in the newspapers as the next grand thing, and after the disaster of ZR-2, the War Department needed something promising to encourage public support of the lighter-than-air program. By late October, Roma was finally able to maintain hydrogen purity in her gas bags at levels considered safe by the U.S. Army standards. It was time to fly. On the morning of November 15, 1921, what seemed like hundreds of people from all over Virginia's Tidewater gathered at Langley Field. Stella Hoover stayed close to the girlfriends and wives of other crew members, while Maria Reed regaled others with the tale of her Italian flight earlier that year. The excitement on the ground was palpable. The barn doors of Langley's hangars opened, and her grounds crew pulled her from the hangar. There was a collective gasp at the sight of the oddly beautiful machine. Newspaper reporters scrawled in their notebooks, and cameras rolled for newsreels of the historic footage. On board Roma, the crew held their breaths as the grounds crew slowly let go of her tethers. Master Sergeant Harry Chapman carefully monitored the tubes that indicated hydrogen purity, while Corporal Flores stayed partially outside of the bag to keep an eye on her tautness. Jethro Bell and Virgil Hoffman took their positions at their engines. Captain Mabry, Lieutenant Reed, and Lieutenant Burt controlled the cables and wheels control cabin of the gondola. It was a flurry of well-managed movements about the ship as the keel steadily left the ground and left the safety. After what seemed like an eternity, Lieutenant Burt indicated that they had reached their desired altitude. Major Thornell raced to the radio room to reach down to the ground below. "How did we look?" he asked. After a brief crackle and pause, a voice radioed back, "Magnificent!" and an incredible cheer rose from every rafter of the ship. It was time now to show her off. Around 11 o'clock, Sergeant Lee Harris heard a creak. Just as he looked out a window of the ship, he watched a small aluminum door break free from the keel and forcefully smash into the large propellers of an engine. The shattered pieces of the propeller tore open the gas bag. He knew he had mere moments to save the ship and his crewmates. He grabbed two men along the way, and they climbed into the gas bag to patch the ballonet so that no more oxygen could leak into the bag. They patched and they patched and patched until they were so overcome from breathing the hydrogen that they passed out. They were removed as soon as possible from the gas bag and returned to the ship, having saved the lives of their crewmates. Upon returning to Langley Field that evening, the sergeant and his fellow crewmates were shaken but unharmed. While the flight was hailed a success, many of the crewmen who witnessed what happened started having troubling feelings towards Roma. Sergeant Jethro Bell, whom I'm pointing to right now, was a founding member of a tongue-in-cheek named group called the Graveyards Club. They advocated getting transferred off the ship, but the Army was unwilling to let their best and brightest go. Jethro wrote to a friend, "If Roma was to come down, no one would be able to get clear of it. This ship is a death trap for sure." But as far as the public knew, Roma was a fine ship, meant to right the wrongs left in the wake of R-38 a few months earlier. Lieutenant Clifford Tinker resigned from the Navy and dedicated his life to making sure that no one else died on a U.S. ship because of hydrogen. He went to everyone who would listen, particularly Secretary of War Weeks. In a means that was probably meant to try to prove Tinker wrong, the Navy reluctantly agreed to test helium aboard a smaller, non-rigid ship, the C-7, and conduct trial flights between Naval Station Norfolk and Bowling Field in Washington, D.C. The data retrieved from this flight was remarkable. Helium did not expand nor contract in the way hydrogen did, and the ship calculated zero gas loss. Despite helium being more expensive, this proved a long-term fiscal advantage. In fact, popular journal of the day, Aerial Age Weekly, wrote, "Summed up, it can be said that the use of helium as a gas for inhalation of airships has been demonstrated beyond doubt." Despite proof of the efficacy of helium, the procurement plant in Fort Worth, Texas was quietly closed in early December 1921. Horrified, Clifford Tinker went directly to Major Van Nostrand. He came up with a figure that it would cost about $14,000 to transport helium needed for Roma from Fort Worth to Langley Field via railroad and maritime means. The plant in Fort Worth had double the amount of helium needed to fill Roma, but Major Van Nostrand insisted to Tinker that the Army simply didn't have the money to do so, and that hydrogen would have to do. As for Roma, she needed to be officially placed in the fleet. An elaborate christening ceremony was scheduled at Bowling Field later that month. The winter of 1921 to 1922 was one met with an unusual chill for this part of the United States. The morning of December 21st, 1921 was indicative of this. Roma was scheduled to fly that day to Bowling Field for the ceremony to place her into the fleet. In Washington, D.C., dignitaries from Italy and America gathered, and Miss Penrose Wainwright was to serve as the ship's sponsor. Everyone huddled together to keep warm as they watched hour after hour. Roma was nowhere to be seen. While waiting, Major Van Nostrand asked Clifford Tinker if he would like to take a ride on board Roma. Without skipping a beat, Tinker replied, "Not until she's filled with helium." Major Van Nostrand scoffed and insisted on the ship's safety. Planes left the field searching for the forlorn dirigible. Several hours later, the vestige of the silvery airship broke through the gray clouds. But what was initially a cheer turned into silent horror as those on the ground watched her shimmying nearly out of control from the clouds towards the ground. Her cables were dropped from the keel, and the ground ran and struggled to pull the gigantic airship to the ground. It was then that it was noticed that the halyard that held the American flag to the ship's rudder had snapped. In a twist of irony, the stars and stripes were flying upside down. Once safely on the field, Major Thornell disembarked and advised Major Van Nostrand that they arrived on only 3 of 6 working engines, with a 4th having frozen but successfully restarted midair. The order was given to shorten their ceremony to allow Roma to return to Langley for any necessary repairs. Midway through this abbreviated ceremony, the airship caught a wind and rolled to her side, tearing more holes in her already fragile bag. More repairs were undertaken in order to make her serviceable. With a skeleton crew on board, with the rest by a rail, Roma limped home that evening, landing at Langley with only 1 of 6 engines working. Following the christening ceremony, Major Van Nostrand was called into a special committee before Congress regarding Roma. However, the transcript of this meeting wasn't initially released. The biggest public takeaway from it all was that it was time to switch out the oily Ansaldo engines for the lighter, more powerful Liberty V12 engines. An order was sent to McField in Dayton, Ohio to begin refitting 6 of these engines for Roma. Back at Langley Field, Roma was temporarily grounded. Major Thornell received orders to report to Washington, D.C., but was given special permission to fly on board one last time. Captain Mabry was his natural successor as commanding officer of Roma, and Lieutenant Reed was promoted to the rank of captain and made the ship's executive officer. With the new year meant new engines. Charles Dvorak led his team of civil servant engineers from McCook to Langley Field to install and train the ship's crew on the newly refitted Liberty V12 engines. In the meantime, Captain Mabry put in yet another request to procure a new gas bag from Italy, citing its fragility. This time, the War Department complied. However, this gas bag would take 6 months to create, let alone ship to Langley Field. Major Van Nostrand was unwilling to keep Roma in the hangar for that long. She needed to be flown, especially with new engines on board. After removing the Ansaldos and installing the Liberties, a trial flight to test these new engines was scheduled for February 21st, 1922. And the gentleman on your screen right now, that is Charles Dvorak. The evening before the trial flight, the officers, crew, and their sweethearts gathered at the Officers Club at Langley. There was music, dancing, cigars, and camaraderie, and a rare moment of fraternization. Students from the balloon school were making a case to Captain Mabry as to why they should be chosen as observers on board the next day. Aside from the need for flight time to earn their wings, they also received extra pay for every flight. Virgil, Hoffman, and Stella Hoover whisked around the dance floor, laughing and engrossed in each other as if they were the only 2 people that existed in the room. They occasionally popped outside and shared a smoke from Virgil's cigarette stash he kept neatly packed in a silver case in his uniform. Captain William Kepner, a non-member of the crew, chatted up his fellow officers. These were men he served throughout the war with and considered more than just his fellow officers, but his brothers. Sergeant Jethro Bell spent time with other members of the Graveyards Club, some with more ominous feelings than others. Private Vernon Peake chatted with civilian engineer Ray Hurley, who was assigned the Peake's engine the next day. Notably missing was Captain Walter Reed, who was resting off a nasty flu. Maria tried to convince her husband to stay home the next day in order to recover, but he would hear nothing of it. If Roma was going up, so was he. A chill hung in the air that night, and the merriment descended into a hush as Roma's men left the officers' club that evening. Many struggled to sleep that night, some with excitement, others with nerves elapsing into fear. The morning of February 21st, 1922 was a cold and dreary one. The sky was overcast and the air hung heavy with a frosty drizzle. As everyone reported to Roma's hangar, Captain Mabry ordered them to get Roma ready, but was uncertain if weather conditions would permit them to fly that day. Walter McNair from the Bureau of Standards arrived at the hangar with an instrument in hand in order to test the speed of Roma with her new engines. Around lunchtime, Captain Mabry temporarily discharged his crew in order to assess the elements of flight day. Corporal Irby Hevron sat with his friend Corporal Nathan Carew, who was a non-flying member of the crew, and in a kind of tongue-in-cheek comment, Hevron said to his friend, "If anything happens to me, you're taking me home." Before long, everyone started reporting back to the hangar to hear what Captain Mabry decided to do. They would fly that day. The flight wouldn't be a long one. It's a circle around the greater Tidewater area and back to Langley, long enough to test the new engines. There was such a manic rush to get all 45 men on board that day. In fact, it was so quick that the ship's mascot dog was left behind with a non-flying member of the crew. Civilians from both Dayton and Langley and non-flying members of the crew acted as Roma's grounds crew. They heaved the behemoth from the hangar into the cold early afternoon. One grounds crew watched as a triangular silvery patch fluttered down from near the bow of the ship. He paid it no mind, figuring that it was purposefully done. Initially, the ship started lifting nose heavy, with her stern faster in the air than her bow. Captain Mabry ordered his to move everyone and everything as far astern as possible. Master Sergeant Chapman frantically adjusted the gas ballonets to account for the differentiation. Captain Mabry insisted that they would reach horizontal equilibrium. After harrowing moments of what must seem like an eternity, the ship balanced and Mabry let out a sigh of relief. Hopefully this would be the last of their troubles that day. As Roma powered away from Langley Field and towards Hampton, Bert noticed that the ship felt like she was moving quicker than usual. Captain Reed also commented that the controls felt more sensitive than he was used to with her. Walter McNair couldn't believe what his readings were telling him. The ship was moving at approximately 75 miles per hour, which was about 25% faster than she had ever done before. When he commented on it to the others in the control cabin, Major Thornell exclaimed, "These liberties are the stuff!" On the ground, people gathered outside to watch as Roma flew over. When passing over Stella Hoover's home in Phoebus, Virgil Hoffman paused his work long enough to call down to his love, who watched quietly on the ground with a pit in her stomach. Just a short distance away, Captain Mabry spotted the white Old Point Comfort lighthouse at Fort Monroe near Hampton. The archaic structure was used as a way marker for pilots in the Tidewater to know when to turn towards the south side of the area. Captain Reed was overcome by the symptoms of his flu and asked Lieutenant Burt to take over his position at the controls. Below Roma was nothing but the river, with the city of Norfolk dead ahead. Corporal Flores climbed into the crow's nest. Cold drizzle and the wind bombarded his face like knives. He carefully measured the gas bag. She was 10 millimeters too loose. He needed to report it to the crew below. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Burt turned the control wheel, and it spun freely in his hands without any response. He did it again just to make sure that it wasn't a fluke. And it wasn't. He pulled the control cables for the rudder. and they gave no response either. His eyes grew wide as he turned to Captain Mabry. "She isn't responding!" On the ground, men from the naval station gathered outside and watched as the airship seemed to be coming towards them instead of remaining aloft. In a nearby neighborhood, a little boy was playing in his backyard while his mother hung the wash. He drew her attention to the airship above. His mother clapped her hand over her mouth, and whispered, "Those poor men." Corporal Flores attempted to climb down into the ship, but found his only passage pinched shut. There was no way he could notify his shipmates below. All he could do was sit there, watch the world pass around him, and wait for whatever may happen. In the passenger cabin, the men knew that there was something wrong. Were they landing? What was happening? They hadn't a clue that the ship was no longer responding. Captain Mabry gripped the useless control wheel and gave the order to lighten the load. They needed to get to the Norfolk Country Club to safely land the ship in the water. Men threw over anything they could get their hands on, tools, furniture, anything that wasn't needed to actually power the ship. But it didn't help. The engines were simply moving too fast to make a difference, and there was no easy way to dump the ballast. The Norfolk Country Club was in sight, but they weren't going to make it. They were heading towards the Army Quartermaster Depot. At the depot, a silent horror turned into rushed panic as the workers prepared for what may inevitably be. Roma seemed to be folding in on herself. Her rudder was no longer perfectly horizontal, but seemed to hang at a 45-degree angle. One civilian plant worker rushed towards the substation that powered the endless electrical wires throughout the depot, but the mud on the ground from that day's rain seemed to slow him down. Aboard Roma, the order was given to cut the engines. The center and the rear engines received the message, but the forward engineers did not. Smokestacks rushed by them, each time Roma narrowly missing them. Corporal Flores gripped the fabric of the gas bag, hunched in a position that would allow him to spring to life when necessary. Captain Reed left the passenger cabin and returned to the control room to see how he could help, while Lieutenant Burt memorized everything he saw around him. This was no longer about saving the ship. It was about saving themselves. In the passenger cabin, men huddled together, crying, praying, and driven by madness over the sheer terror of what was unfolding around them. Lieutenant William Riley, a student observer, crawled towards an open door. His shipmates tried to warn him they weren't high enough for his parachute to open, but he seemed not to hear them, and he jumped. The ground was nearing closer and closer. The electricity hadn't been shut off yet. Captain Mabry continued to grip the control wheel. The last thing anyone heard just before Roma's nose touched the ground was Captain Mabry's deafening call, "My God, boys." Corporal Flores knew he had mere minutes and moments to save life. He saw the tip touch the ground, and he leapt, and he ran and ran and ran. He couldn't tell if he was still in the air or on the ground until someone grabbed him. Lieutenant Burt was thrown through the window of the control cabin, sloshed in the mud. The men on the ground raced to pull out who they could, hoping that somehow the substation had been reached and the electricity to the wires were shut off in time. Before they knew it, a magnificent explosion erupted from the ship, throwing everyone backwards. Flames and black smoke leapt into the air, the fire too hot to even let anyone near it. They watched the writhing silhouettes of men letting out ghastly screams, groans, and one even screaming, "Mercy, oh mercy." But there was nothing anyone could do as they watched these vestiges disappear into the fire. Lieutenant Burt darted towards the fire. Without thinking, he knew he needed to get his shipmates out. He was caught by an officer at the depot who wouldn't allow him anywhere near it. Burt protested, but to no avail. After being turned away, he spotted a group of familiar faces: Ray Hurley, the civilian engineer from the Cook Field, and Private Verdon Peake. They were huddled around something. Burt raced over to them, initially relieved to see their faces, but relief washed away to horror as he followed their gaze. There on the ground lay the mangled body of Lieutenant William Riley. His parachute never fully opened. Bert couldn't tell where or who had gotten out from the ship in the flurry around him. He spotted Walter McNair walking solemnly behind a gurney, which carried an unrecognizable figure. "McNair!" Bert called. "Who's that?" McNair turned to Bert with a stunned expression and replied, "That's Master Sergeant Chapman. He dove back into the flames. He's 3 men, including me." Men were taken to the post public health hospital for triage and care. Bert counted 11 in all. But where was everyone else? There were 45 men who went on board that day. Were they taken somewhere else? Over in Phoebus, Stella Hoover could see a chimney of smoke from across the river. She had no idea what it was from, but her stomach fell with a sickly feeling. It couldn't be Virgil. He told her Roma was safe. He had to be safe. She was supposed to see him that evening. In Hampton, Maria Reed heard a knock on the door. She opened it to find Lieutenant William Kepner. "Mrs. Reed, there's been an accident," he trailed off. "Where's Walt?" she asked. Kepner replied, I don't know." He took her to Langley, where one of his fellow airmen flew her to Norfolk. She had to find her husband. It didn't take long for reporters to arrive on scene. An intrepid New York Times reporter wandered into where the 11 men were recovering at the public health hospital. One survivor asked him, "What of the other boys?" Herbert gulped and informed them that from what he could tell, these 11 men of the 45 were the only ones who were alive. An eerie silence painted the room until someone broke through with the exclamation, "Awful." At the quartermaster depot, it took hours to douse the flames. It was obvious that this was not going to be a rescue, but a recovery. Mr. Rouse from Rouse Funeral Home took a ferry from Newport News to Norfolk in order to collect the remains of Roma's victims. He called upon anyone he knew in the industry, as his vehicle wouldn't be enough. As each body was unwoven from the duraluminum wreckage, anything that could help identify who they were was tagged and marked. A bracelet, coins, insignia pins, a silver cigarette case. Anything. The last man pulled from the wreckage, who is pictured here, still had his charred skeletal fingers tightly gripping the control wheel. Lieutenant Burt remained at the scene. A man who survived numerous airship accidents, who served during the horrors of World War I, stood seemingly shell-shocked. What happened? How could this happen, and why? Why were his shipmates, his brothers, gone? Maria Reed raced into the public health hospital, paying no attention to anyone who attempted to bar her from finding her husband. He couldn't be dead. He couldn't. She scanned the faces until she spotted one all too familiar. There was Walt. His hands and head were covered in gauze, and his uniform had burned from his body. He sat next to Lieutenant Clarence Welch, both in silence. As the bodies arrived at Rouse Funeral Home that evening, Captain William Kemp remained vigilant. It was his duty that night to help identify the remains. Dr. Jesse Mabry also arrived. He was a local dentist, and he was there to find his little brother, Roma's commanding officer, Captain Dale Mabry. The sight that beheld Captain Kepner was overwhelming. It was hard to distinguish if these were bodies or just charred pieces of debris. Some were simply browned, while others were blackened, with heads, limbs, and other parts missing. The stench was unbelievably heavy, but he had a duty to do. But it was a sight that he would never forget. He later stated that these were his brothers, his boon companions. Each man was identified and pieced back together throughout the night. News was telegraphed to Langley Field, where anxious loved ones, including Stella Hoover, waited impatiently for any word of their loved one. It seemed there was more grief than relief. The last man to be identified, the man holding the control wheel, was positively determined to be Captain Dale Mabry. A hero to the end, he never left his post. Dr. Mabry removed his brother's wings from his tattered uniform and a few coins from his pocket. He thanked Mr. Rouse and Captain Kepner and quietly left. Several officers from the Army convened by the next morning to investigate what happened. Roma's surviving crew members were barred from speaking to anyone publicly during the investigation as a matter of confidentiality. Men relayed their story as best they could to the Army officers. Vernon Peake recalled in the moments following the crash trying to pull a man from the wreckage, pulling so hard that the buttons popped off the man's uniform. But there was nothing he could do. He was desperate to save his shipmate, but he couldn't, and he had to leave him behind. It was determined that Roma was doomed to crash. She was simply moving too fast, at too low an altitude, and her bag was far too fragile. Her rudder snapped, and she essentially folded in on herself. But there was a much more grievous factor to consider: the role that the inhalation gas hydrogen played in creating the conflagration that needlessly took 34 lives. Lieutenant Clarence Welch was asked the question that buzzed in many ears: would the death toll have been the same had a non-burning gas been used? Welch's answer was damning. I am sure that the ship would not have burned so quickly, but what a great number of men could have been saved in an attempt made to save the others. The afternoon of February 21st, 1922, claimed the lives of 34 out of the 45 men who boarded Roma just a short time before. Master Sergeant Harry Chapman and civilian engineer Charles Dvorak were barely clinging to life from their grievous injuries. Families began to filter in to claim the remains of their boys. Captain Kepner was always there to help. One father tried to insist to see inside the coffin. He couldn't believe that this was his son inside. He asked Captain Kepner, "My son has a scar on his pelvis. Did you see it?" Captain Kepner tried to deflect, assuring the father that this was his son. When the desperate man wouldn't relent, Kepner placed his hand on the lid and said, "Sir, your son's pelvis is missing." A memorial service was hosted in Newport News on February 24th, 1922. Two bodies, Captain Mabry and Private John Thompson, were used to represent the entire crew. Cars carried family members through the streets while the reserve unit Huntington Rifles guided the way to the tune of Saul's Death March. Over 1,000 people huddled together, crying, staring, holding one another as if they were mourning the loss of their own brother, father, husband, fiancé. At the casino grounds, grand speeches of large memorials, promises to never let their names be forgotten were made. The ship's mascot dog, whom you see next to the casket, was on the ground beside his commanding officer. Planes flew overhead, spraying roses down below. But none of the survivors were there. They were still barred from public comment. And neither was Stella Hoover. Virgil Hoffman was dead. The love of her life, the man she was set to marry in just 4 months' time, violently taken her. She couldn't bring herself to even travel to Eaton Rapids for his funeral. Children lost their fathers, wives lost their husbands, and parents lost their sons. The world was forced to face the fact that we not only lost these heroic airmen, but we lost valued and loved people. Someone had to answer why. It was not only the public, but it was also Congress demanding answers as to what happened that day that cost so many lives. The debates included what to do about the lighter-than-air aviation program, and if they were to continue, should they keep using hydrogen? Chairman Madden, House Appropriations Committee, argued, "Such ships accomplish nothing but to kill people. They are of no value to war." While Chairman Julius Kahn of the House Military Committee stated, "The chances are that efforts will be made to prevent a reoccurrence of such calamity. I feel, however, that so long as the other nations of the world continue experiments regarding flights in the air, our own country will have to keep up with the rest of the world." Congress ultimately compromised. The lighter-than-air programs would continue, but only if The helium procurement plant was reopened and that no other American airship would ever be filled with hydrogen again. The survivors were left in various states in the immediate aftermath of the wreck. Captain Reed steadily recovered and reported to the Naval Airship Station in New Jersey to aid in the construction of the United States' first American-built rigid airship, USS Shenandoah ZR-1. Alberto Flores and Joseph Biedenbach were moved to another air station, still working on the airships, but would never again fly. Master Sergeant Harry Chapman and Charles Dvorak spent a year apiece recovering from their injuries as best they could. Chapman, who was originally thrown from the ship unscathed, was left with scars to his body and internal organs from diving into the flames to save his three of his shipmates. Dvorak was left with not only physical scars but mental ones as well. When he was well enough to return to Dayton, he was unable to resume his position due to what were called nervous spells and what we would probably characterize today as PTSD. Stella Hoover brought herself to travel to Eaton Rapids around the time that she and Virgil were supposed to marry that summer. His family welcomed her like one of their own. When going to her beloved's grave, she fell apart in violent tears. Later that day, she wrote to her mother saying that seeing his grave opened that deep, deep wound in her heart that had never healed. The memory of those 34 men that were needlessly forced to sacrifice their lives in the line of duty was quickly buried alongside their bodies. They were tossed aside, forgotten, and those promises made to give them memorials and honors they deserved for just such a sacrifice were broken. February 1925, in New York City, a beleaguered Clifford Tinker walked into a meeting before a select committee from the 68th Congress. He dedicated the years since Roma to laying blame on Congress for the deaths of those men, including a January 1925 article in Collier's Weekly which lambasted Congress. Mr. Tinker stood across from Representatives Randolph Perkins, Frank R. Reed, Annie S. Prohl, and Patrick B. O'Sullivan. Representative Perkins gestured to him, saying, "Mr. Tinker, will you take the stand?" With a nod of agreement, Representative Perkins swore in Mr. Tinker. The initial questions were obvious ones, verifying his name, address, employment, and his former status as a public affairs officer for the United States Navy. But the timbre of the conversation took a dramatic turn. Representative Reed said, "I now ask the witness, Mr. Tinker, in regards to an article in Collier's of January 24, 1925. He read the passage that directly accused Congress of killing Roma's men. It stated, "Congress, in the name of economy, sold out those 34 lives for about $412 each. The training of the poor chaps alone cost the government an average of about $15,000 each. $15,000 each. Officers and men, and the Roma herself represented nearly $1 million. But what Clifford Tinker didn't know was the truth, and it was far more sinister. A transcript was read to Mr. Tinker from the closed session between Congress and Van Nostrand that was held just after Roma's 1921 christening. All the public knew of the session was that Roma's engines were to be changed, but what was not revealed to the public was far worse. During that fiscal year, the Army had a budget surplus that included $1.3 million that was meant to be used for transportation of supplies for the Army. This would have well absorbed that $14,000 figure Clifford Tinker calculated to transport helium from Fort Worth to Langley for Roma's final flight. In this meeting, Congressman D.R. Anthony Jr. explicitly asked Major Van Nostrand about the supply of helium, and to which he agreed that they had at least double on hand that was needed to inflate Roma. "Mr. Anthony, do you intend to use up the supply of helium and what you say you have on hand, or do you intend to keep it in storage?" Major Van Nostrand replied, "That will be a matter of policy to be decided, sir, but my recommendation as a member of the board would be to conserve it for war purposes, except so far as it is necessary for scientific purposes." Congress leaned on his expertise regarding airships. They are to be absolved of blame that Tinker placed upon them. In fact, their policies following the disaster speak to how horrified they were by the recommendations made to them prior to her last flight. Major Van Nostrand was well aware of the dangers of hydrogen. He knew that Roma was a ship in fragile condition. He put pressure on her crew to get her in the air, and he lied to Clifford Tinker, stating that there was no money to transport the supplies, though well aware that there was. Major Van Nostrand, for whatever reason, turned Roma into a tomb for 34 men and sentenced Master Sergeant Harry Chapman to a very slow and painful death. If there is anyone to blame for killing those men, it is Major Van Nostrand. As each year elapsed, so did the memory of those brave men. Master Sergeant Harry Chapman was the only crewman to receive any sort of commendation for his bravery that cold day in 1922. He was the first recipient of the now defunct Cheney Award, and this is a picture of him many years after the accident. He passed away in 1940 after suffering from lung cancer as a direct result of the damage he sustained, saving his crewmates. These men were heroes. They did their duty, yet we washed our hands of them as if their sacrifice meant nothing. Up until recently, there weren't any public memorials for these men. It was just this past February that, after a great amount of advocacy, a historical highway marker was in Norfolk, and we will be dedicating it this November. With the exception of Master Sergeant Chapman, again, these men were never given any sort of commendation for their sacrifice. Their stories are those deserving of awards, honors, buildings named in their memories, and yet they have been forgotten as if they never mattered to anyone. If this were to happen today, no one would hesitate to grant some sort of commendation upon them posthumously. We would rally around the families and answers and accountability. We would do what we could to never forget them. Why should the 45 men that flew on Roma nearly a century ago be any different? There are still loved ones that grieve for them in the quiet corners of cemeteries where these men were buried. The men of Roma deserve better from us, and it is our responsibility to make sure that they are given what they deserve, that their voices are never again silenced, and that they will never be forgotten. Thank you. And now I will turn it over to Keegan for questions.
Well, thank you for everything, Nancy. That was, I think, an enlightening presentation for many of us, and an opportunity to look at this kind of distinctly distressing period in local history, because I think it's eye-opening to see that these men have in fact been forgotten, and that were it not for efforts like yours to research the subject, but also to ensure that historical markers and things like that are placed, these guys would kind of vanish to what Abraham Lincoln called the silent artillery of time. I think one of the questions that's been asked a couple of times so far this evening is, where exactly is the crash location? Where is that historical marker going to be?
The historical marker is not actually located where the crash occurred. And thank you for the question, by the way. It is located about a quarter of a mile from the actual crash location. If you're familiar with Norfolk near the Naval Station, you go where Terminal Boulevard and Hampton Boulevard intersect, where the Norfolk International Terminals or Virginia Port is today. The crash happened on the port grounds. Nearby on the grounds for their private area of the Crumbly House, a stone was erected, but it has never been publicly accessible. When I saw it for the first time in 2014, I actually had to have an armed guard escort me to the stone. I have never been able to access the actual crash site itself. The sign, we had it erected at the corners of Little Creek Road and Hampton Boulevard, right near the Starbucks, next to the new fire station. And again, we'll be dedicating it this November, and I'll keep information on my social media and whatnot if you would like to attend.
Thank you. I think there's a large number of us that would really appreciate that opportunity. Nancy, we've got some kind of interesting questions that are coming in here from early in the presentation. Do you think that the wreck of the Shenandoah actually overshadowed the Roma disaster?
It sounds like I have some of my LTA people in here tonight. Hi, everyone. I think it did, and I think it was such a dramatic crash, Shenandoah, with it having broken in three parts. The commanding officer, Zachary Lansdowne, being this incredible lighter than air man. It was a very dramatic story, and I think it was so public, the way it could be seen, crashing in three pieces to the ground. And it was such a bigger ship, and it was the first rigid airship. It was about double the size of Roma. Um, and there was just this romanticism around it. And I definitely think it did overshadow, but I don't think unjustifiably. I think all of these airship disasters deserve this equal amount of attention. So thank you for that question.
You and I were speaking briefly ahead of this about the non-traditional tail that was on this airship, that it wasn't the cruciform tail. And we've got a question here inquiring whether or not this particular accident could have been made less severe or somewhat avoided by a more traditional control system.
I would absolutely say yes. That would have been a I wouldn't say a huge difference, but it would have made a difference. The way Roma was constructed, it was an articulated keel. So she was meant to kind of maneuver as the ship lost pressure, gained pressure, whatnot, slightly. With this bottom keel on here and then the bag being above, you had this huge and heavy box kite rudder on the back that was very experimental. And when the ship started folding in on itself per se, this rudder just snapped the control cables and created part of the perfect storm of what happened. Umberto Nobile was not a fan of this particular part of Roma's design. I had some of my colleagues in Italy tell me that it was a byproduct of Celso Uccelli, who pulled it from the Astra Taurus design. And so when Nobile went to design her sister ship, the Norge N1, he made sure that he did not include that on that design, which I think was a nice contribution to the next two ships that came after. So thank you for that question.
You mentioned that Roma's sister was the Norge, obviously an airship that's gone down in history, pieces of which are at the National Air and Space Museum. Are there pieces of the Roma to be found at any of our local museums?
Kind of, sort of. There are, it's mostly in the archives. Hampton History Museum has dedicated many years, even before they were Hampton History Museum, to preserving artifacts from Roma, which were put into the collection by a previous curator, John Mitchell, who recently passed away. Um, but over there, they have like the bugle from the memorial service. They have personal effects from some of the victims. And I heard recently that the Hampton Roads Naval Museum, which is located down in Nauticus, and wonderful little museum. If you haven't been there, I highly recommend it. Has a piece of her in their collection that I haven't been able to get to their archives as of yet. And then Sargent Collection, which is the historic collection for Norfolk Public Library, in a scrapbook has a small piece of her bag. Ironically, there were a lot of people who were coming on the scene to get souvenirs, and my husband's great grandfather was one of those people trying to steal pieces of Roma. I found this out later into my research, and he was trying to steal one of the control wheels and escape with it when he was caught and was taken away from him. There are pieces, one of her engines is display at the Air Force Museum in Ohio, and there are several, I believe one of her propellers is in the collection for the National Air and Space Museum. But I think locally is where we have the market cornered. And I personally have a couple of artifacts, including the dress cover for Sergeant Ryan, who was pictured before. And I have the burial flag for Master Sergeant Duke Flores, which was generously loaned to me by his niece. But the artifacts are lacking right now. And hopefully we'll be able to put together some sort of display in the future regarding her. Thank you.
Later airships saw their aluminum recycled post-crash. Are you aware of such a thing being done with the duraluminum that was left over from the Roma?
That is kind of been my white whale, you could say, because I have every document the Air Force has in their historic collection about Roma, and that was one thing that they never said happened. What they did after the crash, and once they recovered everything they could from her, they took her structure back to Langley and assembled it as best they could, which is how they discovered these control cables snapped. That point, it kind of sat for a little bit and then it was sent off to a scrapyard somewhere. But what actually happened to her duraluminum, I am uncertain. And I don't know if that's something we'll ever know, unfortunately. Um, Something I've been trying to find for many years, and maybe the answer's out there, but who knows? I would think that probably it was either sold or it was scrapped or recycled for future use of some sort, but with certainty, I can't say. So thank you.
Another follow-on question here related to what they did afterwards. Do any of the facilities survive over at Langley? Is there a large, Roma-sized hangar? These kinds of lighter than air facilities do still exist elsewhere in the country.
That is an excellent question. I'm going to show you guys my computer for a second because I'm going to escape out of this to show you something interesting. Now, the hangar no longer exists, and but there are still little pieces of Roma around. And what I'm getting ready to show you is kind of a preview of my forthcoming book. The hydrogen processing plant still stands, and you can see it's kind of in a derelict state. Um, I can't say how I got these images, but I suppose you can figure out how. Um, and the inside is in tatters, but it's just the part of all of it that still stands over at Langley. The cool thing about Langley is it really has tried to emphasize the heritage of this one particular airship throughout its base. And this particular section called the LTA section to talk about the airships that were there. And while the hangar isn't there, several of the streets are named for the Roma victims. On the officer side, you have Thornell. On the enlisted side or the LTA side of the base, you have street name for Sergeant Ryan, Sergeant Lee Harris. You have several of them being emphasized, but of course, with no record or anything up, I have always wondered how many people drive those streets every day and know why it's called Roma Road, for instance. But the fact that there is something there, it's pretty remarkable. But the plant itself is condemned. It's not something I would ever recommend you traverse. Um, but it's still standing, and I think that's what is left of that physical era. So thank you.
Nancy, how did they produce the hydrogen in that facility?
They had these gigantic machines, and I don't have that picture on my computer, but it was these gigantic kind of cylindrical shaped machines. And they were lined up within this giant room, and they filled these casks that were literally stacked almost to the sky with this hydrogen. And it was within walking distance. And it's kind of perplexing in looking at it through a 21st century lens to think of these just metal containers of hydrogen laying around stacked on top of each other. But that way it was so close to the actual hangar itself that they could get it to the airship very quickly. While helium, the only place they could really procure it from, because it was natural, was in Fort Worth, Texas. So that made it a little bit more of an arduous thing to get it to Langley anyway. But the fact they could produce it right there at Langley, they can get it to the ship and have it plentiful on hand was definitely an advantage that the military felt. And when you have this technology where you could either maybe explode in an airship or crash in a very fragile balsam wood looking plane, I could kind of see why some people would take the route of the hydrogen airship. So thank you.
Um, what first got you interested in the Roma? What kind of set the hook and set you off on this path in your life?
It's kind of a funny story. So I back in 2010, I was a new mom and I kind of needed something to do. I loved history, and I am a native of this area and love local history. And so I was researching, so I was writing these articles online for Yahoo, and I stumbled across a picture of this airship, very bizarre looking airship, over top of Norfolk. And it was a composite image. And I just, I thought about the romanticism of it all, the airships, and something we never see anymore, except for, the occasional Goodyear blimp. Um, and I always had this fascination with aviation. In fact, I used to tell my parents when I was a kid I wanted to go into the Air Force. So kind of melding these together, I kind of fell in love with this idea. And then when I found out about these 34 men that died in the line of duty, were never honored, it truly troubled me deep into my core. My father is a veteran of the military. My husband serves active duty. And so trying putting their faces on these men, it bothered me so deeply. And the irony of it all, while researching it and kind of running with it, I discovered that Master Sergeant Jethro Bell is actually a distant cousin of mine. No idea before that. He was from Missouri and my family's from Maryland, but um, so that was interesting running those ancestry lines down and then discovering my husband's own familial ties to the disaster. I tell him all roads in my life seem to lead to Roma, but the truth is trying to get these guys what they deserve. And that's become my mission and my obsessive passion in life is to make sure that we never forget them and we honor them the way they need and that their families receive some sort of comfort that their heroes didn't die in vain. So thank you.
Nancy, as far as you're aware, was it purely a cost and ease of access issue related to the use of hydrogen? We've got a question here, kind of puzzling about why such a known risk, was taken in a time when we weren't at war.
It's kind of funny to look at it in parallel with modern military development, not naming ship names or anything. But it was something that they felt they needed to conserve the helium for war. They were so newly outside of World War One, and it was like a war unlike anything they had seen before. And so they didn't know if they were going to have to service a bunch of non-rigid ships to go and do espionage purposes. During the Blitz in London during World War One, these gigantic rigid airships just would fly over and drop bombs, and they didn't know if they would need that safe gas to power the same type of device in the future. Um, it was a cost-saving measure in a way. I think it was honestly, as far as Major Van Nostrand is concerned, was neglect. Um, he was putting pressure to get Roma in the air to garner support for the program and to recruit new people into the program. And I think a lot of it was not think through and ignoring all the warning signs. And in hindsight, it's like all these major disasters that it's never just one thing that causes it to happen, unfortunately. Um, it was definitely a lot of neglect. Um, and they just didn't want to, I guess is the best way I could say it, if that makes sense. Thank you for the question.
We've got an interesting question here that relates to your sort of expanded personal study of lighter than aircraft. Is this sort of like a gateway for you? Have you since studied the other catastrophes such as the Shenandoah, the Macon, the Akron, or are you really specifically focused on the Roma?
Roma was kind of a gateway drug, you could say, for me. I fell in love with LTA, studying Roma. I mean, airships are just so cool. Um, and then, so after that, I wrote my senior thesis in college about Shenandoah. And then I studied, my current interest is on the K-14 disaster up off the coast of Maine. And then, of course, Noble A's particular semi-rigid ships. And honestly, the lighter than air community is a fantastic one. They are incredible people, so knowledgeable, so interesting and so wonderful to collaborate with that you can't help but be excited talking to them and learning from them and learning together. And we have this wonderful young man, Hendrik, who is putting together this entire like 3D walkthrough of these different airships. And it's fantastic because we're bringing this little niche discipline out to the public, and you have some of the best people there to teach it. And I feel so humbled to be in their company. And honestly, with airships being, again, a niche topic, it's very different than studying, say, heavier than aircraft. Having been a Navy brat and now a Navy wife and being around that maritime culture, you can kind of see some of the same uh, variables in play, whether it's in the air or on the sea. And so it's very kind of this interesting niche in my world. But yeah, it was definitely a gateway drug for me. But Roma is I always refer to Roma as the historical love of my life, and my husband's okay with that. So thank you.
So now that you've confessed to it being a gateway drug and opened yourself up to questions about all other subsequent airship disasters, um, was there a service rivalry between the Army and the Navy relative to their airship programs?
Oh, absolutely. The Navy, basically, the idea was the Navy would develop these giant rigid airships to become aircraft carriers in the sky. So you think about they would have kind of hooks and hangars that these planes would hang on and be able just to take off from. And so they were trying to translate that idea of what would happen at sea into the sky so you can have more inland practical use. And so the Army was originally told that they were only going to have the non-rigid, these tiny balloons that could carry maybe 3 to 5 people, like the one we saw in the newsreel at the beginning of the presentation. And they were going to be used for espionage, for training purposes, for later bombardments. But Billy Mitchell didn't want anything of that. He said, look, we can fly planes too. Why can't we have a big airship for our own? And so Roma was the one they decided to kind of push that envelope with. The thing is, after Roma happened, it was deliberately put in place that the Navy would have the big airships and they would have some small ships, and then the Army would only have the small ships. And no one really fought that after that point. Um, but yeah, it was definitely a huge rivalry, that loving rivalry that has always existed with the Army and the Navy. But it was definitely which branch was going to prevail with how they could use this technology. And the Army could do it just as well as the Navy, so they claimed. Um, but yeah, it was definitely a I don't want to call it rivalry, but it was. So thanks.
And this will be our last question for this evening, but it's probably the topic for an entire subsequent presentation. Traditionally, we don't think of, the term Zeppelin is actually coined to reference the German manufactured um, rigid airships. Can you tell us a little bit about why this one was purchased in Italy? And it was far from the only ship the Italians built, but why have these become sort of quintessentially German things?
Well, the Germans were definitely experts in their own right, regarding coming up with these Zeppelins, or the Zeppelin airship, the Zeppelin airship company. Um, they could create a virtual city in the sky above in these big rigid airships, and to the point where we have the later ships like Hindenburg, for instance, which had a pressure controlled cabin that passengers could smoke in. I mean, they could create whatever they wanted. And so they kind of had the market cornered. But after World War One, they were not able to construct anymore unless it was for one of the Allied forces, which is what Zachary Lansdowne, the commanding officer of Shenandoah, was doing around this time period that we were discussing today. Was he was over there as part of this construction crew. Um, but the Italians wanted their own brand. They had the French, the Italians, and the Germans really had a rivalry at that time of which country had the best airships. And you had in Italy the Astrotaurus ones, which were a semi-rigid type of airship, which they felt that even though it was big, not quite as big as the large Zeppelins that Germany was producing, um, they could still do as much as those big ships, still have as many people, but have more control and practical use, other than just being a floating giant in the air, a terrifying floating giant. So you kind of had that happening, and when everyone really saw during World War One what these Zeppelins were capable of, everyone a rigid airship of their own. And so um, Umberto Nobile was just such a well-known and intelligent and engineer of these ships. And so he came up with this very unique looking airship, because she really is unlike anything other than that. And the Italians were like, you know what? We're going to build this thing, we're going to put it into the war, and we're going to take down those Germans. Well, she wasn't completed until after the war was over, which is why she was refitted. And the problem is with Italy, it really had no money, so they needed to get rid of it. And I suspect that they knew something was wrong with her, given the lack of disagreement regarding the sale price of her, and which is kind of telling that she had issues. She was experimental. And after that point, Nobile built Norge, which was smaller than Roma, which was a very successful airship. And then he built the Italia, which is, again, a subject for a whole another day. I was telling Keegan earlier, I recommend the movie Red Tent if you want to learn more about the Italia story. Um, and then he was sent to the Soviet Union, kicked out of Italy after the Italia disaster. But it was really Germany that ended up having the market cornered. I mean, they knew the engineering, they knew how to get planes and airships in the air successfully. They didn't have nearly as many hydrogen issues as we had over here. And so that's really where that ended up coming up. And then when Hindenburg crashed, because it was such a public display, oh, the humanity, um, it was decided it was about that time the airship program, basically, especially the rigid ones, came to an end because that was such a horrifying scene. And percentage wise, more people survived Hindenburg significantly than survived Roma. Um, but because it was so public, everyone was horrified by that scene. And so we used small airships for several years into World War II. And we have ones like K-14 up in Maine. And then after that, they just kind of dissipated and became more of a civilian thing. And now there's kind of some dabbling into it with the Airlander, which is interesting to look up. And again, another story for another day. So thank you.
We're going to squeeze just one more in here. Was there ever any discussion of changing her name?
Absolutely not. That was one thing that they just did not want to do whatsoever, because what they thought showed was an allyship, a friendship between Italy and the United States by keeping the name Roma, showing that we had respect for them, they had respect for us. In fact, at the christening ceremony, the ambassador from Italy spoke quite vivaciously about how it showed the friendship it had the name. They did add our Royal to it, but they were never ever going to change her name. She was Roma forever. So thank you.
Well, Nancy, that brings us to the end of this evening's program. Thank you again so very much for your time this evening.
Thank you for having me, and thank you all for joining us tonight.